The marble floor in the lobby reflected the dim morning light without any warmth. Standing on that polished surface in the elegant white gown chosen by her mother, Rebecca Belmont clutched a bouquet of roses in one hand and the marriage certificate in the other. She leaned slightly toward the man in the faded shirt, standing in front of her. Speaking in a low whisper so those standing near the tall windows would not hear, she said that she could not afford to lose him for money. She noted that he had none, and that was the only comforting thought she had about the whole situation. The man did not take offense at her harsh words. He simply lowered his gaze toward the flowers, then looked back up at her with a calm expression that almost resembled a subtle smile. His name was Matthew, a 36-year-old worker whose calloused hands bore the unmistakable marks of hard physical labor. His shirt had seen better days, washed far too many times to retain its original brightness. Slung over his shoulder was a worn canvas bag, and poking out upside down was a small stuffed teddy bear, missing one of its plastic button eyes. Behind them, lined up near the glass wall, her family looked at him as if he were an unsightly stain on an expensive tablecloth. Her mother stood perfectly straight with an unyielding posture, accompanied by a wealthy man wearing a tailored suit, who smiled with mild condescension. Beside them stood two other relatives, dressed in dark attire, silently counting down the minutes until this humbling ceremony came to an end. None of them standing in that spacious lobby of glass and concrete knew the truth. They had no idea that the entire soaring skyscraper, the marble under their feet, and the magnificent structure they used as a backdrop to demean the poor man actually belonged to him. Rebecca was the first to sign the document using her mother's fine pen. Mrs. Amelia Belmont would never have permitted her daughter to sign an official record with a cheap plastic pen from a local store. Rebecca's hand remained steady throughout the process. She had learned long ago how to conceal her true feelings behind a calm expression. She signed her full name with the precise cursive her mother had taught her during childhood thank-you notes. Once finished, she passed the pen to Matthew. He accepted the instrument carefully, as if handling a borrowed tool, gauging its weight before pressing it to the paper. He wrote his first name slowly, omitting his family name entirely. The official notary, who had witnessed hundreds of high society weddings across the city, merely raised an eyebrow without uttering a word. In his line of work, discretion was a commodity, paid for by the hour. The legal representative in the gray coat announced that the paperwork was completed. Two simple words echoed softly in the quiet hall, carrying a heavy emotional weight. Rebecca felt the plain band slide onto her finger, a cheap ring bought by size rather than personal taste. She realized that even this ring did not truly belong to her. She would have to return it in 6 weeks. Everything in her life felt borrowed: her gown, her family name, and now her husband. There was no celebratory kiss, nor did anyone ask for one. In a conventional wedding, someone would proclaim that the groom could kiss the bride. However, this arrangement was not a real marriage. It was a financial transaction, disguised as one. Contracts were meant to be signed quickly, so everyone could leave before feelings complicated matters. They stepped outside into the bright midday sun that beat down relentlessly on the wide concrete plaza. The skyscraper behind them was the tallest tower along the bay, belonging to the prominent Alcazar group. Rebecca descended the stone steps, still holding the bouquet of roses, simply because she did not know what else to do with it. Behind her, her family followed in a neat line, surrounded by the faint scent of expensive perfume and poorly concealed relief. Her mother caught up with her at the bottom step, speaking softly without moving her lips, a subtle technique refined by women accustomed to delivering sharp insults in public without attracting unwanted attention. Amelia reminded her daughter that she only had to endure 6 weeks. She instructed Rebecca to maintain a smile and tolerate living among the working class for 42 days, until the legal cancellation was signed, allowing her to reclaim her former life. Amelia carefully adjusted Rebecca's veil with 2 fingers, making a gesture that appeared affectionate from a distance. She added that no one else needed to know how far their family had fallen, keeping the secret strictly between themselves. She then cast a brief glance toward Matthew, who stood 3 steps away holding his worn bag, unable to find a title low enough to describe him. When Rebecca introduced him simply as Matthew, her mother dismissed the name, stating he was whatever the legal documents required him to be. Amelia adjusted her dark sunglasses and adopted her usual cold expression, declaring that their family never truly lost, but merely took temporary pauses. Standing beside a luxury sedan nearby was Samuel, a man who had promised Rebecca a bright future overlooking the bay 2 years earlier, only to walk away the moment her family name faced financial scrutiny in social clubs. He leaned against his car with deliberate ease, his tie slightly loosened, displaying the subtle pity common among those raised never to raise their voices. Samuel admitted he could not resist coming to watch. He glanced at Matthew from head to toe, letting his eyes linger on the worn canvas bag and the upside-down teddy bear, offering a quiet, knowing smile. He told Rebecca to reach out whenever the situation settled down, reminding her where to find him. Rebecca chose not to reply. She had learned early in life that silence often frustrated certain people more than any spoken argument, because it offered them no material to use in response. She walked past him, though she could feel Samuel's gaze lingering on the stuffed toy, as if marking a vulnerability to exploit later. For the first time that morning, Rebecca felt a surge of protective instinct rather than shame or fatigue. The vehicle waiting for them did not belong to her family. It was an old utility truck with a wooden bed filled with planks and a tin can of nails rattling on the passenger seat. Matthew opened the door for her before walking around to the driver's side. He performed the gesture naturally, out of habit, despite her bridal gown and his thoroughly washed shirt. He started the engine, and as they drove away, the soaring glass tower in the rearview mirror gradually shrank until it became a small rectangle, eventually disappearing entirely from view. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Rebecca watched through the window as the scenery changed. The glistening glass towers and polished marble gave way to brick buildings, followed by clotheslines stretched between small balconies, like quiet flags of an forgotten struggle. Every block carried her further from her previous life, and a cold part of her mind, the part shaped carefully by her mother, began keeping track of her descent, like recording a growing debt. Matthew broke the silence, suggesting she could throw the bouquet away if she wished, noting that there was no suitable vase for it at the apartment. Rebecca replied that the flowers were not truly hers either, as her mother had selected them. Matthew nodded slowly, accepting her answer without pushing for further details, and returned his focus to the road. She was grateful for his silence, having ridden in too many cars with men who asked probing questions only to use the answers later. The utility truck eventually pulled up in front of a modest 3-story residential building located in a quiet neighborhood of Savannah, Georgia. The shared staircase smelled faintly of home-cooked meals from various apartments. They walked up to the 2nd floor, but before Matthew could turn his key in the lock, the apartment door swung open from the inside. A small girl stood in the doorway. She appeared to be around 5 years old, slender and pale, with large, observant eyes that seemed accustomed to watching carefully before speaking. She stood firmly at the threshold, gripping the wooden frame with both hands, examining Rebecca from head to toe without fear or greeting. She carried the quiet seriousness of a child who had already lost something important, and was determined not to lose anything more. Looking up at her father, the young girl asked who the visitor was. Matthew gently explained that her name was Rebecca, and that she would be staying with them for a while. The child immediately pressed for a specific length of time. Matthew paused, opening his mouth before closing it without a word. A person might easily deceive the rest of the world, but there were certain honest eyes at home before which excuses failed. Rebecca observed his hesitation and recognized something unexpected in the man her family had dismissed. He was not afraid of her, but deeply concerned about disappointing his daughter. He finally offered a vague response, saying they would see how things progressed day by day. The little girl pondered his words, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. Phrases like, "we will see," were often the empty promises adults used when they lacked better answers, and she seemed well aware of it. She cast one last look at Rebecca, dressed in white, holding someone else's flowers and wearing an unwanted ring, before deciding at that moment that she would not offer her affection easily. Turning around, she walked back inside, dragging the one-eyed teddy bear by its ear across the floorboards. The apartment consisted of one large open space divided by basic furniture. In the center stood a hand-sanded wooden table, accompanied by two mismatched chairs, alongside a smaller child-sized seat. Behind a simple curtain in the corner lay a small mattress for the girl. Nearby, a collection of tools was organized with striking precision, each item hanging neatly from its designated peg, suggesting that useful labor was deeply respected in this household. Matthew pointed toward the only private room with a solid door, informing Rebecca that the bedroom was hers. He clarified that he would sleep on the couch in the main room, while his daughter, Lucy, slept behind the curtain. Anticipating her apprehension, he added plainly that their agreement involved a legal document, not a personal obligation, ensuring she could rest without worry. Rebecca looked at him in silence. It was the most considerate statement anyone had offered her all day, delivered with the blunt sincerity of someone unaccustomed to polished pleasantries. Uncertain of how to respond, she placed her fading bouquet onto the wooden table, where a single rose petal drifted down onto the fine sawdust. To break the quiet, she asked what kind of projects he worked on. Matthew hung his canvas bag on a wall peg, leaving the teddy bear dangling upside down as it observed them with its remaining eye. He wiped his hands on his trousers, an old, reflexive habit, and replied that he built whatever was needed, including walls, roofs, and foundations. He noted that people often assumed a structure's strength came from its height, whereas its true stability depended on how deeply its foundation was set. He added that what held everything together was usually the part that remained completely unseen, before offering a quiet apology for speaking so seriously about his trade. Rebecca held on to his words, sensing they carried a deeper meaning she was not yet fully equipped to understand. Later that evening, while the young girl pretended to sleep behind the curtain, and Matthew worked quietly downstairs smoothing a wooden board to settle his thoughts, Rebecca sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed. Still wearing her bridal gown due to a lack of spare clothes, she counted the days ahead. 42 nights in this humble apartment, before signing the final papers and returning to her former life. She whispered the number 42 to make it feel real. Yet, for a reason she could not quite grasp, the number that ought to have felt like a heavy sentence carried a strange, subtle shift in meaning. Outside, the steady rhythm of his handplane moving over the timber continued, patient, consistent, smoothing away rough edges piece by piece. The first night proved to be the longest Rebecca had ever experienced. Despite having known many difficult evenings, sleep eluded her entirely. The mattress was firm, much firmer than the soft bed she was used to, and the cotton sheets carried a simple scent of laundry soap and fresh air, which felt surprisingly comforting. What truly kept her awake was not the bed, but the distinct nature of the quiet. In her mother's home, silence was maintained by expensive appliances running smoothly in the background, such as the climate control system and the electric gates. Here, the quiet felt alive. The wooden floorboards creaked occasionally, a pipe dripped steadily, and from behind the curtain, little Lucy shifted in her sleep, murmuring brief, fragmented words, as if conversing with someone no longer present. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Rebecca rose quietly to get a glass of water. Tiptoeing across the main room, she found Matthew sitting upright on the sofa in the dim light, staring at the ceiling with a thoughtful expression. Without turning his head, Matthew noted that there was fresh water in the pitcher. He remarked softly that hands often tired sooner than the mind, which felt backward, though one rarely chose the order of such things. Rebecca drank her water while standing by the window. Below, the narrow street was largely deserted, save for a stray dog wandering past a distant streetlight. Nothing about this environment resembled her previous life. Yet, Holding the glass in the quiet room with the man expecting nothing from her, she experienced a rare sense of peace, the relief of being in a place where no performance was required of her. In her mother's world, every interaction served a specific social purpose. Here, for the first time in years, she was simply a person quenching her thirst in the middle of the night. She mentioned that her mother planned to visit on Friday, explaining that Amelia wanted to verify her discomfort to feel reassured, as seeing her content would imply she had given up. Rebecca set her glass down and added that she was merely enduring a set sentence. Matthew nodded slowly in the shadow, without offering easy comfort or debating the duration of her stay. A man accustomed to heavy labor understood better than most not to minimize another person's burdens. He simply stated that he would prepare a simple soup for Friday, noting with a faint trace of humor that serving food to uncomfortable visitors usually encouraged them to leave sooner. Rebecca nearly smiled at his remark. She returned to her room before the expression fully formed on her face, holding on to the quietness of the moment. The construction site where Matthew worked was located 40 minutes away in a rapidly developing sector of Savannah. It was another rising tower, designed with modern glass panels, bearing the name of its distant owner on the surrounding security fence. Rebecca visited the site only once during that first week, to deliver an insulated flask he had left behind, as young Lucy refused to remain alone with her, forcing all three of them to take the utility truck. She observed him from a distance before he noticed her arrival, finding it surprisingly difficult to reconcile his presence here with the man from the ceremony. In the polished lobby among tailored suits, Matthew had seemed out of place, enduring quiet contempt with his head lowered. Here, wearing a hard hat and a leather tool belt, his demeanor was entirely different. The other workers approached him with clear respect, seeking his guidance on technical details. The site foreman, an older man named Henry with thick white eyebrows, stood over a blueprint spread across an empty drum, discussing structural details with him. Matthew pointed directly to a section of the diagram, explaining where stress fractures might occur if not properly reinforced, and the older man agreed without hesitation. Henry walked over to Rebecca while Matthew went down to retrieve the flask. The veteran foreman remarked that Matthew possessed a rare talent for understanding buildings, reading structural plans as easily as others read the morning news. He added with a gentle chuckle that a man with such skills could work anywhere he chose, yet he consistently picked the demanding foundational work. The phrase lingered in Rebecca's mind, joining his earlier comment about structural foundations. She added both thoughts to a growing mental collection of things this quiet man rarely articulated about himself. When Matthew returned to collect the flask, his hand briefly brushed hers. It was an ordinary exchange, the simple contact of passing an item between two people. Yet his palm was warm and rough from hours of physical labor. Having spent her life around individuals with soft hands, her mother, Samuel, lawyers and associates, who had never lifted heavy loads, she felt that roughness acutely, much like cold water after a long drought. She pulled her hand back quickly, immediately regretting the sudden movement, because it revealed how much the simple touch had registered. Matthew thanked her for coming, acknowledging Lucy sitting in the truck with her teddy bear. He remarked softly that the little girl did not travel with just anyone, before returning to the deep foundation pit, leaving Rebecca with a quiet sense of gratitude she did not quite know how to process. The turning point occurred 3 nights later, brought about not by a deliberate conversation, but by a sudden illness. Rebecca woke at 3 in the morning to a raspy, persistent cough coming from behind the curtain. She sat up immediately. Little Lucy was crying softly, with the weary tone of a sick child who had exhausted her strength calling for help. Rebecca waited several seconds, expecting Matthew to check on his daughter, before remembering he was working an overnight concrete pour at the rising tower. He had mentioned he would not return until morning. The two of them were entirely alone in the apartment, a little girl who mistrusted her, and a woman who could easily have remained in bed. No one would hold it against her. Lucy was not her daughter. This was not her home, and her stay was strictly temporary. She had 39 days remaining before returning to her former life. Yet the soft crying continued, sounding increasingly fragile. Something about that vulnerable sound bypassed every lesson her mother had instilled regarding boundaries and personal detachment. Rebecca stepped out of bed, walked across the cool floorboards barefoot, and drew back the curtain. Lucy was running a high fever, her cheeks flushed and hair clinging to her forehead, while she clutched her teddy bear tightly. Spotting Rebecca, the child made a visible effort to appear independent, stating in a weak voice that she had not called for her and wanted her father instead. Rebecca knelt beside the small mattress, responding calmly that her father was working, so she would be helping tonight. She refrained from using the overly sweet tone adults often adopt with children. Instead, her voice was straightforward and direct. Perhaps because the young girl distrusted false affection, having experienced loss early in life, Lucy gradually relaxed her defensive posture. Rebecca had no prior experience caring for a sick child. Her family had always hired domestic help for such matters. However, she relied on basic common sense. She dampened a clean cloth with cool water to soothe the child's forehead, located a bottle of fever medicine in the cabinet, and carefully measured the proper dose under the light of her phone. She spoke quietly to the child, talking about mundane things, the stray dog on the street, the distant sounds of night traffic, providing a steady voice for Lucy to focus on. Rebecca remembered from her own childhood that the hardest part of a fever was the overwhelming sense of isolation it brought. Toward dawn, the fever finally broke, and Lucy drifted off to sleep. Before fully surrendering to rest, the little girl reached out aimlessly until her small fingers found Rebecca's wrist, holding onto it tightly. Rebecca remained seated on the floor with a numb arm, unwilling to pull away and risk waking the child. In the quiet morning light, she realized something that unsettled her far more than any debt. Taking care of this child, in this humble space, was remarkably natural. Using her hands for something genuine felt cleaner and more fulfilling than anything she had done in years. That was how Matthew found them when he returned from the construction site, covered in fine cement dust after 12 hours of manual labor. He stood quietly in the doorway, observing the woman in simple clothes, sitting barefoot on the floor, holding his sleeping daughter's wrist with gentle care. He said nothing, but a subtle change crossed his tired face. For the first time since their brief ceremony, he looked at Rebecca not as a temporary obligation, but as someone capable of providing a strong, enduring foundation for a home. The teddy bear lost its arm the following Tuesday through enthusiastic play rather than neglect. Lucy had fully recovered from her fever and was celebrating with high energy, dragging the stuffed toy through imaginary adventures around the apartment until the worn stitching finally gave way, leaving the limb hanging by a single thread. The child stared at the damage with genuine distress, her lower lip trembling as she fought back tears over what felt like a major tragedy. Rebecca stepped forward, offering to help repair it. Lucy pulled the toy closer to her chest, looking at her with natural skepticism, asking if she even knew how to sew. Rebecca extended her hand, explaining calmly that needlework was one of the few practical skills she had been taught. She promised they could fix the toy named Toby before the evening was over. After a moment of consideration, the child cautiously handed the bear over. Rebecca retrieved a small sewing kit from a tin on the shelf and sat at the wooden table under the yellow light to carefully repair the worn fabric. Lucy sat across from her, watching the procedure closely, and began talking in the open manner children adopt when they assume an adult is preoccupied. She mentioned softly that her mother used to fix Toby's seams in the past. Rebecca kept her focus on the needle, having learned over the past 2 weeks that the young girl shared her true thoughts more freely when not put directly on the spot. Lucy added in a low voice that her father tried his best to sew, but his stitches were large and uneven, though she never told him because it made him sad. In that simple observation lay the quiet reality of their home, a small child holding back her own trivial disappointment to protect her father's feelings. and a devoted father doing his best with rough hands to ensure his daughter felt cared for. Rebecca finished securing the arm with a sturdy knot. Then, acting on an impulse she did not overthink, she selected a spare button from her coat and stitched a brand new eye onto the bear to replace the missing one. When she handed the completed toy back, Lucy examined the neat stitching and the new button eye with quiet wonder. Though she did not offer an immediate thank you, having learned to be cautious with sudden kindness, she made a subtle gesture that evening. For the first time, she left the curtain of her sleeping nook drawn halfway open, leaving just enough space to view the main room, ensuring she would not feel isolated if the fever returned. Matthew noticed the open curtain when he came in, though he refrained from commenting on it. That night on the sofa, he lay awake in the dark for a long time, aware that subtle connections were forming within his home that he had not anticipated. Connections that, once established, could not easily be undone. On Friday afternoon, Amelia Belmont arrived as planned to assess her daughter's living conditions. She climbed the 2 flights of stairs with an expression of profound reluctance, using a gloved hand to ring the doorbell. When Rebecca opened the door, her mother stepped inside without a greeting, scanning the apartment to catalog every detail of its modest state: the simple wooden table, the mismatched chairs, and the lingering scent of cooking from the shared hallway. She sighed quietly, reminding Rebecca that there were still 40 days remaining in their arrangement. However, a pot of lentil soup was simmering gently on the stove, prepared by Matthew before he left for his shift. The aroma filled the small apartment with a sense of warm hospitality. When Rebecca offered her a bowl out of courtesy, Amelia inspected it with deep skepticism, before sampling a small spoonful, fully prepared to dismiss it. Yet she found she could not. The simple meal possessed a rich, comforting flavor rarely found in high-end establishments, carrying the patient care of someone cooking thoughtfully for a household. Amelia set her spoon down, commenting dryly that it was passably prepared for a simple home. Rebecca quietly noted that Matthew had made it himself. Her mother brushed the comment aside, remarking that cooking was a basic necessity for those with limited means. She wiped her lips with a napkin and advised Rebecca not to become overly attached to a modest lifestyle, sharing that she too had experienced financial hardship in her youth, and asserting that poverty lacked any real beauty. Rebecca chose not to argue. Yet, listening to her mother dismiss the warm meal, she realized that the true coldness in her life had never come from modest surroundings, but from the emotional detachment of her former world. She had spent 24 years in luxurious homes, constantly feeling an underlying chill that no heating system could ever warm. Amelia departed earlier than expected, proving Matthew's subtle prediction correct. Offering a warm meal to difficult guests often encouraged them to take their leave sooner. The afternoon that shifted their perspective occurred during a clear autumn day along the coast. Matthew brought Lucy and Rebecca to the construction site, where the crew was hosting a modest gathering on the 12th floor to celebrate Henry's birthday, offering a wide view of the city and the ocean beyond. Rebecca stood near the safety perimeter, looking out over Savannah below. Around her, workers with weathered hands shared simple meals and honest laughter, treating her with straightforward courtesy without any knowledge or care regarding her family background. Henry walked over, holding a beverage, and nodded toward Matthew, who was carrying Lucy on his shoulders near a secured ledge, pointing out the structural layout of the building. The veteran foreman remarked that Matthew was teaching his 5-year-old daughter how to understand structural blueprints, showing her where the primary support columns rested. Henry took a sip from his cup and observed thoughtfully that Matthew could provide his child with almost anything he wished, yet he chose to teach her how things were sustained from the ground up. He looked closely at Rebecca, noting that some men hid their true capacity out of insecurity, while others kept their capabilities quiet, because they had once been valued solely for their wealth and refused to repeat that mistake. He added with quiet certainty that Matthew belonged to the second group. Rebecca did not fully grasp the foreman's subtle hint at the time, but she stored his words alongside her other observations about her husband. Looking across the floor at Matthew standing against the autumn sky with his daughter, she no longer saw a man of limited means, but a man of profound character and quiet strength. She recognized his patient nature, his practical care, and the deep devotion he showed his daughter. Everything her former social circle had taught her to regard as unimpressive now appeared far more valuable than the superficial luxury she had left behind. That evening, as they drove back with Lucy asleep between them clutching her repaired teddy bear, Rebecca spoke quietly while looking out the passenger window. She remarked that her family had placed her with a man they deemed insignificant, so no one would care when the arrangement ended, wondering aloud if her mother realized that Rebecca herself was being treated as something easily set aside once her usefulness diminished. Matthew kept his eyes focused on the road, driving in silence long enough for her to think he might not respond. He finally stated calmly that people were not items to be returned. They were either supported or left behind, and her mother had made her choice. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, adding that in her position, he would choose to offer support instead. They completed the journey without turning on the radio or searching for conversation, comfortable in a new kind of quiet, the shared understanding of two people who were beginning to hope the journey would not end anytime soon. Samuel Arrieta was not a man to accept defeat easily. He waited for a convenient moment and approached Rebecca one Thursday as she returned from the local market carrying 2 groceries bags, accompanied by little Lucy. He appeared abruptly on the sidewalk, stepping into their path with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to taking up space. He offered to assist with the bags, taking one from her hand before she could decline, stating firmly that they needed to speak. He cast a glance down at Lucy, who remained close to Rebecca's side, watching him with clear suspicion. Samuel lowered his voice, remarking on the child's circumstances before turning his focus back to Rebecca. He insisted that the entire living arrangement was unreasonable, noting that only 4 weeks remained before she could sign the cancellation papers and put the ordeal behind them. He offered an apology for stepping away when her family faced financial difficulty 2 years prior, admitting he had acted selfishly and expressing a desire to make amends. Rebecca listened to him quietly, recognizing that his words mirrored the sentiments of her mother and their shared social circle, framing her current life as a temporary setback to be erased. She looked directly at him, pointing out that he had left when her status declined and only returned when her situation seemed recoverable. She added calmly that there was no need to repair anything, as genuine repairs were meant for honest mistakes rather than calculated choices. Samuel's expression hardened as his charm faded. He remarked dryly that she seemed to have developed an unhealthy appreciation for modest living, mistaking hardship for dignity. He then revealed the information he had gathered, noting that he had looked into her husband's background. He pointed out that Matthew was a simple tradesman, with no established public profile or corporate records, suggesting that a person who left no trace was either entirely insignificant or hiding something substantial. He departed, leaving Rebecca with the groceries and a troubling doubt she had not asked for. Her mind replayed his words regarding Matthew's clean background, creating a lingering uncertainty. That evening, she observed Matthew with new questions in mind as he hung his bag on the peg, arranged his tools neatly, and prepared dinner with quiet composure. She realized that his steady demeanor was unusual. True financial struggle typically brought visible anxiety and constant worry about basic expenses. Yet Matthew navigated daily life with absolute calm. A quiet tension settled over the dinner table as both of them carried unspoken thoughts they were not yet ready to share. Amelia Belmont accelerated her plans that same week, requesting Rebecca meet her at an upscale cafe in the historic district to review the upcoming schedule. Sitting at a table with fine linen, her mother informed her that the notary had confirmed the date. In 25 days, the debt cancellation would be finalized, clearing the family's financial obligations completely. She added that the legal annulment of the marriage would be filed immediately afterward, requiring Rebecca only to attend and sign the documents as expected. Rebecca looked at her mother, seeing a woman who viewed relationships purely through the lens of utility and financial security. Amelia genuinely believed she was acting in her daughter's best interest, possessing an absolute faith in wealth as the sole protection against hardship. Rebecca asked softly, what would happen if she chose not to proceed with the annulment? Amelia set her teacup down, dismissing the idea as foolish. She leaned across the table, taking her daughter's hand, asserting that affection without practical means faded quickly. She warned that facing real hardship would eventually turn love into resentment, insisting that financial security was necessary to sustain any lasting relationship. Rebecca remained silent during the ride home. She felt caught between Samuel's suspicions and her mother's pragmatic warnings, fearing she might be confusing a novel experience with a genuine future. When she arrived at the apartment, Matthew immediately sensed her distress. Misinterpreting her quiet mood as regret over her current circumstances, he withdrew into his own defensive reserve. Having experienced the loss of a past relationship due to financial doubts, he recognized the distant look in her eyes and chose to protect himself from potential heartbreak. He noted her meeting with her mother, acknowledging the remaining 25 days until the agreement concluded. He suggested coldly that it was best not to grow attached to a temporary home, as departing would only prove more difficult later. Rebecca was surprised by his sudden distance, unaware that he was attempting to shield himself from emotional pain. Feeling hurt by his cold tone, she responded in kind, guarding her own pride by agreeing that tracking the remaining days was the sensible path forward. They ate their meal in complete silence, a heavy, distant quiet, born of mutual fear and self-protection. Behind the curtain, young Lucy sensed the shift between them, clutching her teddy bear tightly without coming out to say goodnight. Outside, rain began to fall steadily, dripping through a small gap in the ceiling into a metal tin Matthew had placed on the floor. Neither of them slept well that night, listening to the consistent sound of water hitting the metal container like a ticking clock marking time. It was young Lucy who ultimately broke the impasse 3 days before the scheduled signing. Rebecca found the little girl sitting behind the curtain, holding Toby tightly, with a look of deep concern on her small face. Lucy revealed that she had overheard her father talking on the phone about the 25 days and the upcoming cancellation. Looking up with wide, anxious eyes, she asked if Rebecca was going to leave just like her mother had, adding that while her mother had not wanted to go, Rebecca seemed to be choosing to depart. Rebecca felt a surge of emotion. She knelt beside the small bed, realizing she could not offer empty explanations to a child who saw through pretense. She gently explained that her mother's departure was due to circumstances beyond her control, whereas staying or leaving now was a personal choice. When the child asked why the legal cancellation was necessary at all, Rebecca found herself without a satisfactory answer. All the logical justifications from her former world, debts, social standing, legal agreements, felt entirely meaningless in front of the young girl. She realized there was no genuine reason to leave this home other than fear and external pressure. Rebecca looked at her warmly and promised she would not be leaving. She stated clearly that she would not sign any cancellation papers, choosing instead to remain with them regardless of any modest circumstances or household repairs. Lucy studied her face carefully to ensure the promise was sincere. Satisfied, the little girl dropped her protective guard, threw her arms around Rebecca's neck, and whispered a soft plea for her to stay, calling her mother for the very first time. Rebecca held the child tightly, tears coming to her eyes. Looking over Lucy's shoulder, she saw Matthew standing in the doorway. He had returned early from work and heard the entire exchange, his expression filled with profound emotion at the realization that she had chosen them freely. That evening, Rebecca stated her decision to Matthew directly, declaring that she would not agree to the annulment. She acknowledged her mother's warnings about practical difficulties, but affirmed her choice to remain, asking for nothing in return other than his understanding. Matthew listened, deeply moved by her commitment. He came very close to revealing the entire truth about his identity right then in the small kitchen. However, his long-standing fear held him back. He worried that revealing his vast wealth might obscure whether she had chosen him for who he was or for his resources. He asked her to wait just 3 more days until the legal meeting, promising that everything would be fully explained once the formal paperwork was completed. Though puzzled by his request, Rebecca agreed, trusting that the essential decision had already been made. The morning of the legal meeting arrived clear and bright. The group gathered at the downtown notary office at 11 o'clock. Amelia Belmont dressed impeccably, the family attorney holding his briefcases, Rebecca calm and composed, and Matthew wearing his single well-ironed shirt. Lucy had been left in the care of Henry for the morning. Waiting in the conference room was the creditor's legal representative, alongside Samuel Arrieta, who had shown up uninvited, claiming to support the Belmont family. Before any papers could be presented, Samuel placed a file onto the table, announcing that everyone deserved to know the true background of the man Rebecca had married. He asserted that his investigation revealed Matthew had no registered corporate holdings, no property deeds under his name, and no verifiable employment records, labeling him an unreliable individual with hidden motives. A heavy silence filled the room. The elderly legal representative handling the debt account stood up slowly, adjusted his glasses, and looked at Samuel. The senior representative corrected him, explaining that while Matthew did not appear as an employee in corporate records, it was because he was the sole owner of the entire enterprise. He opened his own official ledger and placed it in the center of the table. He revealed that Matthew had requested his full name be withheld from the initial marriage certificate for personal reasons. He formally announced that the sole owner of the Alcazar Group, the primary creditor of the Belmont estate, and the owner of the grand skyscraper where the wedding had taken place, was Matthew himself, making him one of the most successful builders and property owners in the region. The room fell completely silent. Amelia turned pale, while Samuel stared at the documents in utter shock, his speculative file instantly rendered meaningless. Rebecca looked at Matthew in complete astonishment. The man she had known through simple meals, practical trade work, and quiet devotion was the hidden figure behind the city's largest development firm. Matthew looked only at Rebecca, speaking softly to explain his actions. He admitted his fear had driven his secrecy, having once been valued only for his wealth in the past. He shared that when he met her, the daughter of the only man who had treated him with genuine respect when he was just a starting laborer, he wanted to be chosen for his character rather than his assets. He expressed his profound gratitude, noting that her decision to stay with him when she believed he had nothing was more valuable than any project he had ever built. Rebecca stepped forward and took his worn hand, reminding him of her comment on their wedding day about finding comfort in his lack of wealth. She admitted she had been mistaken, explaining that what truly mattered was not his material status, but his humility, his integrity, and his decision to let her choose him for who he was as a person. Amelia stood speechless, unable to process the scale of the revelation, while Samuel quietly gathered his papers and exited the room without a word, entirely humbled by the outcome. The formal cancellation of the family debt was completed, not through an annulment, but through the permanent union of two people who had found genuine trust in one another. They celebrated their formal wedding the following spring, in a manner that reflected their true values. There were no grand marble halls or elaborate displays. Instead, Matthew arranged a gathering in the spacious backyard of Henry's home, under the shade of a large oak tree, using simple wooden chairs for their guests. The construction crew attended in clean attire, bringing home-cooked dishes, music, and fresh flowers cut from their own gardens. Rebecca wore a modest dress, adorned with field flowers, that Lucy had carefully placed in her hair. Lucy served as the ring-bearer, walking slowly across the grass holding a small cushion. Resting alongside the rings was Toby, the teddy bear featuring its 2 stitched arms and button eyes, serving as a reminder of the care that had brought their family together. Amelia attended the gathering as well, sitting quietly among the guests. Before the ceremony, she approached Rebecca, adjusting one of the flowers in her hair, with genuine affection, admitting softly that she was glad her daughter had chosen her own path, based on character rather than wealth. Rather than moving into a lavish mansion, Rebecca and Matthew built a comfortable, well-designed home, structured around lasting foundations. The house featured a large kitchen for family meals and a bright bedroom with eastern windows for Lucy, ensuring she woke to morning sunlight every day. Placing the repaired teddy bear on a prominent shelf in their living room, Matthew often reminded visitors that the toy represented the resilience of things that were carefully mended rather than discarded. 2 years later, their family grew with the birth of a healthy baby boy. Matthew held his newborn son with the same careful, supportive grip he used when working on fundamental structures, ensuring the child felt completely secure. Lucy proudly welcomed her new brother, offering to share her cherished teddy bear with him, so he would grow up knowing the warmth and care that defined their home. Standing together in their quiet home while their children slept, Rebecca and Matthew reflected on their journey. They had discovered that true security and lasting affection were not built on grand pretenses or material wealth, but on the quiet, enduring foundations of mutual care, honest choices, and unconditional devotion.